what is it? What is it that they see? That's weird. All you can see is. Well, you know that there's a famous story from the Soviet Union that these guys shot at a UFO and it turned them into stone.
The crushing dark beneath the Arctic ice, it's one of the most hostile environments on Earth, a place few have ever seen firsthand. Yet, decades ago, the Soviet Union sent divers into this frigid abyss.
In August 1941, the Allies launched Operation Dervish.
Whispers and modern discussions, sometimes sparked by figures like Joe Rogan, hint at strange and unsettling discoveries made during these perilous descents.
And I opened my eyes in my mask in the darkness with my flashlight, and I saw, like right in front of me, this huge eyeball. Like about the size, I don't know, of a saucer.
What exactly did the Soviets encounter in the frozen depths? Did they find something beyond explanation, or is the truth buried deeper than any wreck? Let's dive into the cold, hard facts and the swirling speculation.
We were talking about space, about how we know more about space than we do about the ocean, which is true.
These strange humanoid figures were much bigger than human beings and appeared to be wearing helmets of some sort. What on earth are we to make of an encounter like this? It's one thing to talk about humanoid entities deep in the lake.
Before we plunge into the potential mysteries seen by Soviet divers, we need to understand why they were even there. The Soviet Union's push into the Arctic wasn't some casual weekend trip, it was a massive, state-driven endeavor fueled by ambition and necessity starting seriously back in the 1920s. Picture this vast, frozen wilderness, and for the Soviets, it represented opportunity and strategic advantage. One major driver was the Northern Sea Route. This potential shipping lane along Russia's Arctic coast could dramatically shorten voyages between Europe and Asia, bypassing traditional routes controlled by other powers. Developing and controlling this route meant icebreakers, ports, weather stations, and extensive exploration, including understanding the treacherous ice conditions from above and below the surface. Early expeditions, like the one involving the icebreaker Sibiryakov in 1932, which completed the passage in a single navigation season, highlighted both the promise and the peril.
At one point, some people are like, what's going on with Antarctica? There's some activity up there. We want to find out what's going on. Investigate with a giant fleet, just a fleet to go bang, bro.
Beyond trade routes, the Arctic was seen as a treasure trove of untapped natural resources.
That's beautiful.
Even early on, geological surveys hinted at vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals locked beneath the permafrost and the seabed. Exploring these possibilities, even with the primitive technology of the time, was a national priority. Divers could have played a role, however limited, in examining underwater geology or placing rudimentary equipment. And then there's the inescapable shadow of geopolitics. As the 20th century progressed, especially into the Cold War era, the Arctic became a critical, strategic frontier. It was the shortest path for bombers and missiles between the USSR and North America. Establishing military bases, airfields, and surveillance capabilities in the region was paramount. Asserting territorial claims over vast swathes of Arctic land and sea was part of this power play. Scientific research stations often served dual purposes, gathering climate data while also keeping an eye on the neighborhood. So, Soviet presence in the Arctic was a complex mix: economic dreams, resource hunger, scientific curiosity, and hard-nosed military strategy. It was this intense focus that inevitably led them to explore not just the icy surface, but the dark waters hidden beneath. Let's be clear, diving in the Arctic during the mid-20th century wasn't like a recreational dip in the Caribbean. It was brutal, unforgiving, and pushed the limits of human endurance and technology. The challenges were immense, starting with the obvious: the cold. Water temperatures hover near freezing, around -2 degrees Celsius, 28 Fahrenheit, thanks to the salinity. Even brief exposure without protection is lethal. Early diving suits offered minimal insulation compared to modern gear. Divers likely wore heavy, cumbersome canvas suits, perhaps with wool layers underneath, relying on surface-supplied air pumped down through hoses. These hoses were lifelines, but also potential points of failure, vulnerable to kinking, freezing, or snagging on ice. Then there's the ice itself. Much of the Arctic Ocean is covered by thick sea ice, sometimes several meters deep. Cutting or finding a hole was just the first step. Divers operated in near-total darkness beneath this icy ceiling, often with limited visibility in the water itself. The ice overhead wasn't static, it shifted, groaned, and could potentially close off the entry-exit point, trapping a diver below. Imagine the psychological pressure, floating in the freezing black, knowing tons of shifting ice are above you.
Oh, God.
And you just scuba dive on down, and then you swim into that thing, and then once you pop up in that hole, it's like you're in a swimming pool. But it didn't have a motor, so it was just like stuck on the floor, like a big cylinder.
Whoa.
And while these dives probably weren't exploring the extreme abyssal depths we think of today, even relatively shallow dives under Arctic conditions carried significant risks. Early decompression knowledge was less refined, increasing the danger of the bends, especially with the physical exertion required in the cold. Equipment failure, a leaking mask, a frozen regulator, a severed air hose could be catastrophic with little margin for error. Support was crucial but also limited. Icebreakers like the Sedov or support ships were essential platforms, but they too battled the harsh conditions. Deploying and retrieving divers safely in icy waters required immense skill and coordination. Compared to today's remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and advanced submersibles that can explore extreme depths for hours in relative safety, these early Soviet divers were true pioneers, relying on rudimentary gear, immense courage, and perhaps a fair bit of luck. Their operational depth and duration would have been severely restricted, limiting what they could realistically achieve on any single dive. It paints a picture less of leisurely exploration and more of brief, perilous excursions into an alien world. For a long time, the deep Arctic Ocean, particularly the areas permanently covered by thick ice, was considered something of a biological desert. The logic seemed sound: perpetual cold, darkness limiting photosynthesis, and perceived low nutrient levels. Not exactly a welcoming environment for a bustling ecosystem. Early scientific thought often painted a picture of sparse life clinging to the edges or migrating seasonally. But what if the Soviet divers peering through their faceplates into that dim, freezing water saw things that didn't quite fit this picture? While we lack specific, verified Soviet dive logs detailing biological encounters, it's highly plausible they observed life forms that were, at the time, poorly understood or entirely unknown to science operating from the surface. The underside of sea ice itself, for instance, hosts a unique community of algae and small crustaceans, a potential food source that could support life deeper down. Could divers have witnessed unexpected aggregations of fish, jellyfish, or other invertebrates adapted to these extreme conditions? Think about the kinds of adaptations required: specialized antifreeze proteins in their blood, slow metabolisms to conserve energy, unique ways of finding food in the dark, discovering species exhibiting these traits, or simply observing known species in unexpected locations or abundances beneath thick ice cover would have been scientifically significant. It could have provided early hints that the Arctic marine ecosystem was far more complex and resilient than previously assumed. Perhaps they saw examples of chemosynthesis-based life near methane seeps on the seabed, similar to ecosystems later discovered around hydrothermal vents in warmer oceans, though this is more speculative for the technology and depth capabilities of the time. More likely, they might have encountered larger elusive creatures like specific types of Arctic cod, Greenland sharks, known for their longevity and deep cold habitats, or perhaps unusual cephalopods navigating the dark waters. Any observation that deviated from the barren wasteland theory would have been noteworthy. Even documenting the absence of expected life in certain areas could have contributed valuable data. While sensational modern narratives might hint at monstrous or bizarre creatures, the reality of Soviet biological discoveries through diving was likely more grounded, yet potentially groundbreaking for its era. It could have involved documenting unique species, observing unexpected behaviors, or simply gathering evidence that life was more persistent and diverse in the high Arctic than science had credited. These glimpses could have subtly reshaped understanding, paving the way for later, more technologically advanced studies of this unique environment.
In August 1941, the Allies launched Operation Dervish. It might not be the most famous operation of the Second World War, but Dervish and the operations that were to follow.
The Soviet Union's drive into the Arctic wasn't just about passages and positioning, it was fundamentally about resources. The vast frozen north was suspected to hold immense geological wealth, and exploring the seabed was a crucial part of confirming those suspicions and mapping the territory. While deep-sea drilling was far in the future, divers could have played a valuable, if limited, role in the initial phases of underwater geological investigation.
At one point, some people are like, what's going on with Antarctica? Have you heard this? Where they sent Admiral Byrd up?
Imagine divers descending through the murky water, not necessarily looking for exotic life, but for the texture of the seabed rock formations or signs of mineral deposits. Their direct observations, even in limited visibility, could supplement data gathered from surface ships using rudimentary sonar or grab sampling methods. They might have been tasked with visually inspecting specific underwater features identified through soundings like ridges, outcrops, or unusual depressions. The Lomonosov Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range dividing the Arctic basin, was a major feature mapped during Soviet expeditions. Could divers have provided any close-up observations of its shallower sections? More significantly, the Arctic is now known to contain enormous reserves of oil and natural gas, particularly on the shallow continental shelves like those in the Barents and Kara Seas, including areas like the northern Ob Basin. While large-scale exploitation came much later, the initial exploration phases involved identifying promising geological structures. Could Soviet divers have collected seabed samples in specific areas, looking for telltale signs of hydrocarbons or the types of sedimentary rock formations typically associated with oil and gas? Perhaps they observed natural methane seeps bubbling from the seabed, direct evidence of hydrocarbon systems below. Their work might also have involved inspecting underwater infrastructure related to exploration, like marker buoys or early sensor equipment placed on the seabed. Documenting the composition of the seafloor, whether it was mud, sand, gravel, or bedrock, was essential for understanding the region's geological history and resource potential, and also crucial for any future construction or installation projects, including pipelines or drilling platforms. While the divers wouldn't have been conducting complex geological surveys themselves, their eyewitness accounts and potential sample collections could have provided valuable ground truthing for the scientists and strategists back on the surface, adding small but vital pieces to the enormous puzzle of Arctic geology and its hidden riches. The Arctic wasn't always just a strategic chessboard or a potential resource bank. For centuries, it has been a challenging route for explorers, whalers, and traders, many of whom met unfortunate ends in the unforgiving ice. The cold water and ice can act as remarkable preservatives, meaning that remnants of past human activity might lie scattered across the seabed. While perhaps not the primary goal, it's conceivable that Soviet divers stumbled upon or were even directed to investigate such submerged historical artifacts. We have concrete examples of Soviet land-based expeditions finding historical traces. The discovery of artifacts on Fedaya Island in the Laptov Sea during the 1940s, linked to a possible shipwreck from the early 17th century, proves the Soviets were encountering evidence of earlier Arctic ventures. It's logical to assume that similar discoveries could have occurred underwater. Imagine a diver scanning the seabed for geological samples or inspecting ice formations, suddenly noticing unnatural shapes, timbers from a long-lost ship, discarded equipment from a failed expedition, or maybe even personal effects trapped in the sediment. Expeditions like the ill-fated voyage of the Chelyuskin, which sank in the Chukchi Sea in 1934 after being crushed by ice, left a known wreck site. While recovering the entire ship was out of the question with the technology of the time, later Soviet diving efforts could have potentially involved inspecting the wreck site to study ice dynamics, salvage specific items, or simply document its condition. These encounters wouldn't necessarily be mysterious in the paranormal sense, but discovering a centuries-old shipwreck or artifacts from a historic expedition preserved in the cold depths would certainly be a significant and perhaps even haunting find. It connects the divers not just to the geological deep time or the immediate Cold War tensions, but also to the long and often tragic human history of Arctic exploration. Such finds, while perhaps not widely publicized unless they held specific intelligence value, would have added another layer to the Soviet understanding of the Arctic domain, a domain marked by both natural wonders and human endeavors, successful and otherwise. We can't talk about Soviet activity in the Arctic during the mid to late 20th century without acknowledging the massive elephant in the room, the Cold War. The Arctic wasn't just a scientific frontier, it was a critical military theater, a silent battleground between superpowers. It's almost certain that some Soviet diving operations were tied directly to military objectives, shrouded in secrecy far deeper than any divelog might reveal. The Arctic Ocean became a key operational area for submarines. Both the Soviet Union and NATO deployed nuclear-armed subs beneath the ice, playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Could Soviet divers have been involved in missions related to this underwater struggle? It's plausible. They might have been tasked with inspecting or maintaining Soviet underwater surveillance equipment, hydrophone arrays designed to listen for enemy submarines. Conversely, they could have been deployed on risky missions to investigate suspected foreign listening devices or other technology detected on the seabed. Locating and potentially recovering lost Soviet military hardware, torpedoes, parts of aircraft, or even sensitive equipment jettisoned from submarines would also be logical tasks for specialized diving teams. The strategic importance of the Northern Sea Route also had military implications. Ensuring passage for naval vessels, including submarines surfacing in Polinia's areas of open water surrounded by ice, required detailed knowledge of underwater obstacles and ice conditions. Divers might have been used to survey potential choke points or clear minor obstructions. Given the extreme secrecy surrounding Cold War military operations, especially anything involving submarines or underwater intelligence gathering, it's highly unlikely that detailed records of such dives would ever be declassified or made public. Any truly unusual or sensitive finds made during these missions, whether it be advanced foreign technology or something harder to explain, would have been classified at the highest levels. This inherent military secrecy provides fertile ground for later speculation. If divers did see something truly anomalous, whether technological or otherwise, during a classified mission, the official record would likely be non-existent or deliberately misleading. This military dimension is crucial for understanding why definitive answers about Soviet diver sightings remain so elusive. This potent mixture of genuine Soviet Arctic activity, the inherent dangers and unknowns of the environment, and the thick veil of Cold War secrecy feeds directly into the kind of modern speculation we see today, particularly the stories recently amplified on platforms like Joe Rogan's podcast. So let's address the specific spark for this discussion. Claims popularized through channels like Joe Rogan's podcast in 2024 and subsequent online discussions, suggesting Soviet divers encountered truly bizarre or mysterious phenomena in the Arctic depths. What are these stories actually alleging, and how do they stack up against the historical context we've explored? The narratives often hint at things beyond unusual fish or old shipwrecks. They might vaguely mention encounters with strange marine life that defy known biological classifications, sometimes implying creatures of unusual size or form. Other variations lean towards the technological, suggesting divers found anomalous objects, things that seemed artificial but didn't match known Soviet or foreign equipment. Occasionally, these tales take on a more paranormal or even conspiratorial tone, hinting at USO activity or discoveries so shocking they had to be suppressed. You might hear phrases like "what they weren't supposed to see," or implications of encounters that deeply disturbed the divers. It's crucial to understand where these narratives often originate. They rarely, if ever, cite specific, verifiable Soviet-era documents, declassified reports, or named first-hand accounts that can be cross-referenced. Instead, they often seem to stem from second or third-hand retellings, perhaps originating from anecdotal stories passed down over time, misinterpreted accounts of genuine but less sensational discoveries, or even deliberate misinformation or hoaxes amplified online. Joe Rogan discussing these topics brings massive attention, but his platform often explores speculative ideas without necessarily presenting them as a verified fact. The subsequent YouTube videos or articles titled Joe Rogan Reveals often latch onto the most sensational aspects, sometimes stripping away nuance or caveats present in the original discussion. This doesn't mean Soviet divers saw nothing interesting. As we've discussed, they could have encountered unknown species, geological oddities, or Cold War artifacts. The harsh, disorienting environment itself could lead to misperceptions. But the leap from plausible discoveries to truly extraordinary or paranormal encounters requires extraordinary evidence which is conspicuously absent in the public domain. These sensational stories might reflect a modern fascination with Arctic mysteries and Cold War secrets, perhaps blending fragments of truth with exaggeration and the inherent human tendency to fill knowledge gaps with compelling, if unsubstantiated, narratives. Think of it less as documented history and more like modern folklore echoing from the Cold War's icy depths. So, if these dramatic stories are circulating and we know the Soviets were diving extensively in the Arctic for decades, why isn't there a smoking gun? Why can't we just pull up a declassified Soviet file that details exactly what their divers encountered, strange or otherwise? The frustrating lack of concrete, publicly available information about specific Soviet diver sightings isn't necessarily proof of a cover-up of something extraordinary, but rather a result of several mundane yet significant factors. First and foremost was the pervasive culture of secrecy within the Soviet Union, especially concerning anything related to military activities, strategic resources, or operations in sensitive regions like the Arctic. Information was tightly controlled and records were often classified by default. Furthermore, documentation practices of the era, particularly for potentially hazardous field operations, might not have been as meticulous or standardized as today. Logs might have been lost, damaged, or simply never compiled in great detail, focusing only on primary mission objectives. Add to this the potential for records to have been archived obscurely, intentionally destroyed during periods of political change, or simply remain classified in Russian state archives, inaccessible to most researchers. The technological limitations we discussed earlier also play a role. Early divers lacked the sophisticated cameras and sensors common today. Their observations were first-hand accounts, potentially subjective and difficult to formally document, especially if what they saw was fleeting or poorly understood. Combining Soviet-era secrecy, potential loss or inaccessibility of records, and the limitations of early diving technology creates a significant void in the historical record, a void that speculation readily fills. So what did Soviet divers truly see beneath the Arctic ice? The tantalizing whispers amplified by modern media promise chilling encounters and hidden truths. Yet the verifiable record remains frustratingly silent on specifics. While they undoubtedly faced incredible dangers and likely made scientifically and strategically valuable observations, perhaps encountering unique life, mapping resources, or finding historical relics, the claims of truly anomalous or paranormal discoveries lack concrete backing from Soviet sources. The truth likely lies somewhere between mundane operations and sensational myths, forever obscured by time, secrecy, and the crushing icy darkness of the Arctic deep.